What I want to talk about today is what we call the Reconstruction of the North. What happens in the North in the aftermath of the Civil War? Now there, the Reconstruction doesn't end in 1877. It's a long-term process. It goes through what Mark Twain called the whole Gilded Age, all the way up into the early 20th century. You will remember we have mentioned Charles and Mary Beard and their idea of the Second American Revolution, the Civil War being the Second American Revolution. As I have said, as an explanation of the causes of the Civil War, it leaves much to be desired. As a discussion of the consequences of the Civil War, it still is a very powerful concept. The Civil War created the political and institutional framework for a giant economic and political revolution in the northern part of the country and western in the next 30 years after the Civil War. The ouster of the planter class from control of the federal government makes possible the implementation of policies like the high tariff, like the national banking system, and many others, the Transcontinental Railroad, which create the framework for rapid economic growth. Between the Civil War and World War I, let us say, the United States underwent one of the most profound economic revolutions any country has ever experienced. The national consolidation of industrial capitalism, the tremendous expansion of cities, the conquest of the West, and the subordination of the South as what is, in effect, a colonial economy within this new emerging industrial leviathan. It's also the period at the end of the rise of the giant corporations, U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, et cetera, controlling key sectors of the economy, and, as I said, of violent labor conflict. By World War I, the United States is by far the predominant industrial power in the world. In fact, the industrial output of the United States at the end of the Civil War is far below that of Great Britain. By 1914, the United States produces more manufactured goods than Britain, France, and Germany put together. In other words, it's a whole continent now of industry, greater than the European continent. Agriculture also expands in this period. It doesn't stop. The settlement of what we call the Middle Border, the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, tremendous expansion of agricultural productivity also. The South does not experience any of this. The South lags behind. Next time we will see what happens in the South. The South falls further and further behind, locked into a declining agricultural economy with minimal industry, little pockets of industry here or there, very, very little. Really, as the economy grows rapidly, the South does not share at all in this economic transformation. It's also a period of violent swings in the economy, up or down. The middle of the 1870s, the middle of the 1890s are periods of serious economic depression. Before the 1930s, the term the Great Depression was used for the 1890s, a worldwide depression, but particularly acute in the United States. So all this posed a fundamental challenge to the old free labor ideology, which in which equality was supposed to be the norm, in which economic independence was the goal, and in which class conflict was an aberration, where the harmony of interest between employer and employee was really at the core of that old free labor ethos. And finally, national politics seemed to be totally isolated from these developments. It didn't seem like whoever was elected president, it didn't make a heck of a lot of difference in terms of this rapid economic transformation. So let's just look a little bit at some of these things I've just summarized. First of all, what we call the Second Industrial Revolution. The first industrial revolution before the war was centered on cotton, right? The cotton textile factory was the symbol, the key location of the first industrial revolution in Britain, in other parts of Europe, and in parts of the northern United States. And of course, cotton was the key commodity of the first industrial revolution. Cotton is still important in the late 19th century, but not nearly as central as it had been. The second industrial revolution is the revolution of iron and steel and the railroad. The iron and the steel factory is the symbol of the second industrial revolution, like the textile factory was of the first. The United States produced 7 million tons of steel by 1900, a tremendous amount. Railroad track mileage tripled and then tripled again between 1860 and 1880 and 1880 and 1900. Meanwhile, factory production becomes the norm. Instead of, remember, before the war, manufacturing was still typically done in very small-scale enterprises. Now the large factory with 50, 100, 200 workers becomes much more typical. Even though agriculture is developing, is still growing, the percentage of the population in agriculture is shrinking. By 1890 is the first year that the census reports more people working in non-agricultural work than in agricultural work, and that includes the South, which is all agricultural. And 1890, of course, is also the year where they declare the closing of the frontier. There no longer is a frontier of settlement. The West has been completely conquered by, the expansion of the nation. It's also an era of instantaneous communication. The telegraph we saw, and other inventions in the early 20th century, the airplane, the automobile, the telephone, things which would shape life of the 20th century for many, many decades. And as I said, it's also the period of corporate consolidation, U.S. Steel, these other things, all controlling large sectors of the economy. The important thing to remember is there was almost no countervailing power to the power of these giant corporations. The modern, even though the Civil War had tremendously expanded the power of the national government, the modern bureaucratic state didn't exist. There were no agencies, no regulatory authorities. There was nothing to, and moreover, the corporations via influence, bribery, campaign contributions and everything, pretty much dominated both major political parties, and their ideology, which I talked about last time, the ideology of social Darwinism, of the survival of the fittest, of the government keeping out of economic issues, was widely influential. A kind of a cynicism about politics was dominant here. Let's see if I can find, there's one other image I wanted to show you, if I can figure out where it is. No, that's not. Yeah, there it is. It's kind of hard to see. The bosses of the Senate. This is a cartoon from the 1880s with the U.S. Senate, and the real power is these giant economic trusts, the corporations, all sitting behind the senators, sort of telling them what to do. This is a sign, a kind of a critical image of the way politics was operating.